4,
2,
1.
Einmal.
Balkans calling. Voices from the region.
Today I'm talking to Vjeran Pavlaković, who has spent some time here in Regensburg as a visiting fellow at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies, the EUS. I'm Ger Duijzings, and I will have a conversation with Vjeran today about his work, his life. He is collaborating with us on our new Seafield project. He also gave a talk about his current research at our Snack Lab seminar. And as a way of brief introduction, he's a professor of cultural studies at the University of Rijeka in Croatia. So, Vjeran, welcome to our podcast series. Perhaps we could start with telling, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about yourself and your research. Your name obviously links back to the region, if you can call it like that. But you grew up in the US, right?
Yes, thank you for having me on this podcast and having me here in Regensburg. It's always a lovely experience, and I'm looking forward to coming back. But I was born in Zagreb, Croatia, and when I was 4, I moved to the U.S. and spent time in Ohio. But let's say my formative years in Tucson, Arizona, high school and college, and then PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle, and then a brief stint in Washington, D.C. on a postdoc before returning to Croatia in 2006 on a postdoc research fellowship where I actually started getting into this memory and research and symbols. And then since 2008, I've been teaching at the University of Rijeka in the Department of Cultural Studies.
Yeah. While sort of studying in the US, you actually already were engaging with topics that had much to do with the region, I think. Can you tell us a little bit more about your PhD research? Because that's where it all started, sort of linking your research to sort of the former Yugoslavia, or not?
Yes, I was doing Latin American history in Tucson, and then I visited Croatia in '96 for the first time since the war, and I'd been reading Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, and then coming back to Croatia, having left Yugoslavia in 1988 for the last time, and I was fascinated by these issues of memory and identity, and that's what got me interested in doing research in, let's say, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and that's what went to the University of Washington to do a PhD in the region, and it was actually Yugoslavs in the Spanish Civil War was my topic. And I was on a Fulbright in Croatia 2002 to 2004, and even though I was working in the archives and looking at this period of the 1930s, I was fascinated by how Croatian society was so obsessed or focused on the Second World War. It was commemorations for Bleiburg, it was commemorations for Jasenovac, and the newspapers, it was lots of debates about symbols, especially the use of this Ustaša symbols. It was a time when Croatian generals had been indicted by the ICTY. General Ante Gotovina was on the run. So there's a lot of tension in society and a lot of debates about both the recent past but also the Second World War period. And so even though I was doing research for the PhD, I was collecting a lot of material on memory and symbols, and that's what I was able to convert into a postdoc project, which allowed me to come back then in 2006.
And that's the point where you actually started living in Croatia again, is that?
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, it was a project, Red Stars, Black Shirts, on symbols, commemorations, and contested histories that I had for 2 years.
Yeah. And then perhaps you developed some kind of, I know you as having almost like sort of an obsession for monuments, and photographing lots of them around the region, let's say. Can you tell us a little bit more why you're particularly interested in this, in, let's say, in monuments, in commemorative practices? What is your kind of motivation to study this particular topic?
Yeah, well, growing up, I was also fascinated by art and was doing my own artwork. So I suppose one draw is the aesthetic fascination of not just the Yugoslav socialist modernist monuments, which perhaps are the most powerful images of this, but all the other ones also from Western Europe and then also in the United States, many monuments. So I think that was definitely a draw. And I also like to, another passion was hiking or urban exploring. And then when you combine, this exploring a town, finding monuments, going there or going up, into the wilderness and tracking down that monument, I think it was almost a hobby that then becomes, a subject of research. I know in your own work, oftentimes your obsessions have led you to produce amazing research. As an anthropologist, I'm maybe as a historian more tied to the archives, but I think that with the cultural turn in history, we can read monuments as text. So I'm just collecting a different kind of text and how a different monument portrays the past. It's history or historiography in public space. What's written on a monument, where it's located, what kind of visual image does it have, has it been changed, defaced, blown up, officially changed, edited, moved, returned, all these interesting lives of monuments that started with the symbols, but then turned into the commemorations, then turned actually into these sites of memory to track down.
One of the things you've been doing more recently in this field, I would say, is to look also at, let's call them vernacular monuments, or murals and graffiti. So how do you fit them into this more general topic, let's say?
Again, this was probably drawing on my past interest and my still current interest in art and various kinds of other art forms. Graffiti, which is just the words, are interesting in terms of having your voice sometimes when it's political graffiti in a space that maybe you can't express yourself. And so I was initially collecting just phrases, often related to either the generals that were captured or other clever graffiti referring to either Tito or even Tudjman that you can find on Croatian walls. So I was collecting that for quite a while, and then, as I said, my interest in visual arts, looking at street art, maybe that's not inherently political, but then in more recent years, I've noticed that there is this convergence of the street art and the visual aesthetics and political messages, and in Croatia specifically with the Croatian War of Independence, or the Homeland Wars it's called there, and just seeing how many cities have these images. And slowly, as I've been collecting an archive of these, you can also see how they're being used as traditional sites of memory. Priests are blessing them. They have dates. They're functioning like monuments, essentially. I mean, the material and the text that these historical murals have are very similar to classic monuments. They're just maybe more visually appealing. And that's also interesting in seeing how, for talking about collective memory or cultural memory, and how it's transmitted to the next generations. And this is a language that speaks to the younger generation, and it's now being perpetuated. So I think that's what's fascinating. But then realizing as I travel around that this is a language that isn't just Croatia or the former Yugoslavia, but many other countries, many European countries, and also the United States, which has a very lively street art scene, and now politically charged graffitis and murals, whether it's George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, to the recovery of this lost memory in Arizona that I've also been looking at, much longer, slow memory processes.
Yeah. I came across this concept of slow memory. What do you mean actually by that? What is the idea of slow memory? So the project you did on slow memory, or you're still doing, is that right?
I'm part of the project. It's a cost action, so it's cooperation in science and technology in Europe, and it's a large network with over 30 countries, and it brings together scholars from all kinds of disciplines and fields, and there are 5 work groups in this project, and I'm in the conflict one. There's also environment and labor and welfare and politics. And it's really a 4-year project, and we're trying to figure out what does slow memory mean. That's a great project. We have the name, but now we've got 4 years to slowly think of what slow memory means. And maybe it's different for each of these work groups, but one way that I've been looking at it with some colleagues, slow memory could be memory of processes that take much longer. So I think in the modern world, we're focusing on events and these like battles or victims that are tied to really short events, very emotionally charged, but oftentimes are these much longer and bigger processes. Or let's say the conflict against indigenous peoples in the United States. And that's, we don't have so many documents or images, especially let's say in Arizona, because these were things going for decades and decades, the taking away of their land and so on. So that's one aspect of slow memory, looking at these longer processes. Another one is the commemorating of slow memory. Could it be a quick commemoration, or could it again be a mural that shows or depicts a much longer period of time? And the third one, which I think is maybe my favorite for this project, is that we as scholars have to take things slow. We're always on deadlines, deliverables on a project. You can never actually get deep into a concept. And so the idea of this project, we had our first meeting on the Isle of Portland, which is in the UK. No one's heard of it, but it's famous for Portland stone. So we were there for several days thinking about these ideas and taking walks. And it was actually quite a great experience. And our next meeting will be on the island of Tres. So again, taking a longer time to think about it. But unfortunately, we live in this contemporary world where even though you want to take things slow, there's always a deadline, there's always a deliverable around the corner. But I think it's an interesting project and allows us to approach memory from many different perspectives. And you can say that memory studies is about slow memory because we're always thinking about the process. But now we've just given it a name, and it allows us to play with the term. So hopefully we've finished our first year. We've got 3 more years to come up with the definition. So I'm happy to come back. Then we can talk about it.
It reminds me a bit of this slow cinema. I'm not sure whether you know the Philippine filmmaker Diaz. I think he makes these extraordinarily lengthy films of 8 to 10 hours or so. He's one of the proponents of this slow cinema, and actually is also dealing a lot with with traumatic events in the case of Philippine history. So perhaps that's an interesting figure to look at.
I was talking to another filmmaker who wanted to do documentary films. Also, he was calling it slow documentaries, and he would film things for like 10 hours of like setting up a stage or something. And he wants to document, to transmit to the next generations of how to do it, because maybe it'll be lost. So he was also making these really long films. It's a great idea. I don't know if I have the time to watch them though.
You are also engaging with this topic of dark tourism, as far as I have seen. I mean, what's your take on this? I mean, do you look at it kind of critically? Because dark tourism has been criticized to a certain extent by people saying, you bring tourists, you commodify things. Let's say the suffering and death of people in camps, for example, is being kind of commodified to make it attractive for tourists to visit. So what is your take on this? Let's say evolving trend of dark tourism.
Yeah, that's a great question in so many aspects. So this dark tourism or war tourism or remembrance tourism, there's many ways of calling it, and it's going to these memorial sites, it could be going to the monuments, it could be going to battlefields. And so there's clearly an interest in this, and it's not necessarily a modern thing, but as tourism has increased, and of course before Corona, if you look at places like Auschwitz or maybe some other sites memory, the 9/11 Museum, for example, in New York City. The numbers are quite high, so there is a need for people to go to these places. But you're right. And how do we do this ethically? It cannot be completely commodified, but we also talk about, never forget. And there's a reason for remembrance and education, but you don't want to go too much and make it overly commodified, as you said. And I was involved in a number of initiatives dealing with these Yugoslav socialist monuments and developing tours and including it in a cultural heritage route, but not just to exploit it for the Western eye, because there is that danger, whether they're in movies or in films or in videos or photography, but really to look at them as cultural heritage and also engage with local historians and tour operators and so on. So that was a project that I was working on with the Regional Cooperation Council in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but unfortunately they didn't extend that project. But I think there's a lot to think about this, as tourism, especially for a country like Croatia, relies on tourism, and how do we move forward, how do we develop it, how do we take advantage of all aspects of the cultural heritage, including these darker aspects. Another example is Goli Otok, which had been Tito's gulag, which is calling out for the development of some kind of memorial site there. And people do go there. Right now it's a little bit chaotic. So people are already going. It's not that you would bring people to something that they're not going to. You would just create a framework that has both the dignity and the historical aspect and the educational aspect, and some element also of tourism. But I think this is a great topic and definitely will require a lot more discussion. Also, the city of Vukovar, another example where this war tourism plays an interesting role.
I mean, you are kind of an academic that sort of engages also with the broader audience, I think. So I've seen that you're also part of the team, for example, that was working on the Capital of Culture program, Rijeka 2020. I think Rijeka had really bad luck in terms of the fact that the corona pandemic happened at the time when Rijeka should have actually received a lot of visitors, etc. Could you say a few words on what your role exactly was in this program?
I was part of a team, Seasons of Power, and it was really about tackling and engaging with some of the darker aspects of Rijeka's history and showing it through both academic conferences, but also art installations and performances and exhibitions and so on. My, let's say, smaller part of that was a little project called Memoryscapes, and we were really trying to identify the various transformations of Rijeka. And that was really a city that had so many transformations in the 20th century and so many different ideologies ruling over it in parts of different countries. So I thought it would be interesting to present that not just to the domestic audience, but to all the visitors, to try to understand these historical entanglements and layers of memory. And it is unfortunate that the pandemic came right at the time when we were trying to get people to come and mingle, which is the exact opposite of what we were being told to do. But I think there is a legacy of it, and a lot of people worked hard on the project, and there are this new museum area with the Museum of Modern and Contemporary History. There's a new city museum. Maybe one of the most interesting aspects is the transformation of Tito's boat Galeb into a floating museum, which will also tackle the issue of and legacy of socialism and have a place for conferences and discussions on there as well. So that's still being worked on. And I also had an exhibition on the cultural memory of the Spanish Civil War, and as one example of these memoryscapes.
Perhaps the last question I would like to ask you, what are you working on currently? You gave a talk here on Dalmatians in the desert. Perhaps you can explain a little bit what that project is about.
Yeah, so this was actually going back to my roots in a way, because I'm writing now about the history of Arizona and these immigrants from Southeastern Europe who came to Tucson. And it was actually a project initiated by my mother, who was a geographer at the University of Arizona, had gone into retirement, had begun collecting information about these. Initially these called them Croats, but they're really, almost all of them came from what was the former Dubrovnik Republic. Are they Dalmatian? Their entire identity. That's also one of the topics we're going to be analyzing, and it's a story about a small community, but I think they played a big role in Tucson, Arizona from 1880 to 1920, really at this transformative moment for both Tucson, a peripheral desert city that suddenly is becoming a modern city in the American Southwest, and Dalmatia, or Austrian Dalmatia, also going under transformations and becoming this new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And looking at transnational connections, looking at issues of the borderlands, the legacy of settler colonialism, issues of creating communities abroad, and these immigrant communities, and how did they exist or did they not exist, these sort of cultural or memory entrepreneurs who are so key in forming a community, or if they're missing, it doesn't exist, and you have this assimilation. So I think looking at Tucson as a case study, it's also been quite interesting in dealing with a lot of issues about the past and what happened with indigenous peoples, and also the various hierarchies that existed in Tucson at this time. So there's a couple of interesting vignettes and stories, and it's been a challenge actually to find that narrative. And you were at the lecture, the talk, and we discussed this, and it's a little bit different than my usual topics of monuments or commemorations or memory politics, which in many ways seem to write themselves. The material there guides you. And here it's required a little bit of creativity to bring out the story that we want to tell, and have it for maybe a popular audience to sort of try to shift the writing, but also highlight some of these real serious issues which Tucson and the Southwest and the United States is dealing with right now on the border, and these historical legacies.
Yeah, I think that's, again, crossing the ocean to a certain extent back home. Having crossed to Croatia to do lots of research there, now you're in a way getting back again to the US, I think, which is an interesting trajectory in my view. So thank you very much for this very interesting conversation, and I hope we will see you back soon here in Regensburg.
Yes, again, thanks a lot, and looking forward to host you in Rijeka for another podcast with you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
If you are interested in the topic of memory and culture of remembrance and would like to keep on listening, we would like to recommend the Connecting Memories podcast by Paul Leworthy, especially the episode with Prof. Patrizia Violi on memory and monuments. Thank you for listening. This was Balkans Calling, a podcast produced by the Seafield Project.